She walked onto a classified military training range carrying a clipboard and a blood pressure cuff, and the laughter started before she even reached the gate. They called her the bandage lady. They asked if she'd gotten lost on the way to the infirmary. The most senior operator on the base, a man whose confidence filled rooms before he entered them, picked up his sniper rifle, held it out toward her like a joke, and said, "Since you're here, sweetheart, why don't you give it a shot?" She took it. She didn't fumble. She didn't hesitate. She settled into a shooting position so practiced, so completely automatic, that every man on that range stopped breathing. Nobody laughed after that. And if you want to find out who she really was, what she'd done, where she'd been, and what happened to every single person who underestimated her that day, stay with me until the very end. Like this video, subscribe to my channel, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story can travel. Now let's go back to where it started. The drive from Tucson to the Hargrove Desert Training Corridor took 47 minutes on a good day, and Nurse Lena Vasquez had been making that drive for 3 weeks without a single good day. The road was straight and colorless, 2 lanes of cracked asphalt cutting through scrubland that didn't care whether you passed through or didn't. The mountains in the distance looked painted on. The sky above them was the kind of pale, washed-out blue that came before real heat, the kind that warned you to drink water before you thought you needed it. Lena drove with the windows down because the air conditioning in her truck had been broken since May, and she hadn't gotten around to fixing it. Her hair was pulled back in a low knot. She wore her civilian contractor badge on a lanyard over her dark green scrubs, and the badge said Vasquez, L. Tactical Medical Support, which was a title that sounded more important than the people at Hargrove treated it. She was used to that. Her job at the Hargrove Desert Training Corridor, a remote special operations training installation about 60 miles outside of Tucson, was to provide on-site medical support during high-intensity combat exercises. She was there to monitor for heat casualties, treat range injuries, document any incidents that required a report, and stay out of the way. Those were the official duties. The unofficial reality, which she'd understood within the first 48 hours, was that she was furniture. She was the woman who handed out ibuprofen and refilled the ice packs. She sat in the shade of the medical tent while the operators trained, and she was acknowledged approximately never. That was fine. Lena had worked in environments where being ignored was the best possible outcome. She knew how to make herself useful without making herself visible. What she hadn't anticipated was Petty Officer First Class Damon Rourke. She saw him for the first time on a Tuesday, which was when Bravo Squadron arrived at Hargrove for a 2-week precision marksmanship and tactical integration exercise. They came in 3 vehicles, drove onto the range like they owned it, which in a practical sense they did, and Rourke climbed out of the lead truck and stood there for a moment with his hands on his hips and looked at everything like he was doing it a favor by showing up. I was tall, somewhere in the range of 6'2", with the kind of physical build that came from years of actual work rather than gym maintenance. His face was weathered, not unpleasant, with a jaw that looked like it had an opinion about everything. He wore his uniform with the casual ease of someone who'd stopped thinking about it long ago. His patches indicated a SEAL team designation that Lena recognized. His expression indicated someone who had been told he was exceptional for so long that he'd started to believe the telling was the same as the truth. He looked at the medical tent. He looked at Lena. He looked away. That was the introduction. The real problem began on Wednesday morning when Lena was conducting her pre-exercise check of the range medical supplies. She was moving through the storage area adjacent to the operations building, cataloging inventory with a pen and a printed checklist, when Rourke walked in with 2 members of his team, a compact dark-haired operator named Garza and a younger one the others called Peck, who had the eager energy of someone in his first major exercise. Rourke stopped when he saw her. He looked at the clipboard, then at her scrubs, then at her face, then at the clipboard again with the expression of a man doing a math problem he found insulting. "Who authorized a civilian in here?" he asked, not quite to her and not quite to anyone else. "Medical contractor," Lena said. "Inventory check. I'll be out of your way in 5 minutes." "Inventory check." He repeated the words like he was tasting something he didn't order. "For what?" "Medical supplies. Trauma kits, IV fluids, tourniquet stock. Making sure everything's in place before the live fire block starts this afternoon. Rourke looked at Garza. Garza looked at the ceiling, which Lena interpreted as a form of practiced diplomacy. The look of a man who'd learned not to agree out loud when his superior was being unreasonable, but also not to object. "What's your name?" Rourke asked. "Vasquez." "How long have you been working medical support?" 7 years in this role, longer before that." "Before that doing what?" There was a pause that lasted slightly too long, not because Lena didn't have an answer, but because she was deciding which answer to give, and the two available options had different consequences. "Field medicine," she said. "Different context." Rourke studied her for another moment in the way that some men studied things they'd already decided they didn't need to understand. "Just don't touch anything you're not supposed to," he said, "and stay off the range when we're running drills. Last thing I need is a nurse wandering into a live fire lane." He left. Garza followed. Peck lingered for half a second, seemed to notice that he'd lingered, and followed quickly. Lena looked back at her clipboard. She made a small notation next to the tourniquet count and kept working. Tip. By Thursday, she had a decent read on all of them. Bravo Squadron was 9 operators for this exercise, plus their senior NCO and a technical consultant from a defense contractor who was there to oversee the advanced targeting systems. They were good at what they did, genuinely good, not just credentialed. And Lena observed this the way she observed everything on a range, which was carefully and without signaling that she was doing it. Rourke was the best among them. That was the complicating part. He wasn't posturing when he carried himself like the most capable person in the room. In most situations on this range, he probably was. His marksmanship was clean and deliberate. His tactical decision-making under simulated stress was faster than his team's and more often correct. And he had the kind of physical endurance that didn't come from talent. It came from years of grinding through things that would have broken someone less stubborn. He was arrogant, but he'd built the arrogance on something. That made him harder to dismiss and, in a different way, more dangerous than someone who was simply wrong about himself. The problem wasn't his ability. The problem was what he did with the certainty it gave him. He cut off the contractor's briefing on Thursday afternoon because he'd already decided how the targeting system worked and didn't see value in hearing otherwise. He assigned Peck to a secondary observation role during the morning exercise rather than letting him run the primary lane he'd been designated for, which was his right as the senior operator, but also visibly diminished someone who clearly needed the repetition. And when Lena happened to be walking past the operations area during the debrief, he stopped mid-sentence and said to the room generally, "Can we get the medical support to wait outside? This is a tactical discussion." Lena was not in the tactical discussion. She had been walking past it, but she stepped outside because that was easier than making it a thing. She sat on the tailgate of her truck and ate a granola bar and looked at the mountains. They were copper-colored in the late afternoon light, edged with shadows that moved slowly as the sun dropped. The air smelled like creosote and hot rock. Somewhere across the range, someone was running a calibration shot, and the report rolled across the desert flat and clean and loud. Lena ate her granola bar. She wasn't angry. Anger was a state she'd largely moved past, not because she'd resolved the things that caused it, but because she'd learned that anger was expensive and she had limited reserves. What she felt instead was something more like watchfulness, the low, steady attention of someone who had been underestimated many times before and had learned to let the underestimation work. She was watching Rourke, and she was watching the range, and she was watching the targeting system the contractor had brought out, and she had already noticed something the contractor hadn't. The advanced targeting system, a modular remote unit that integrated with the range's existing sensor array to provide real-time feedback on long-range marksmanship, had been operational for 2 days when Lena first spotted the anomaly. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't paying close attention to the right variables, which most people weren't, because most people on a training range were paying attention to the shooting and not to the mechanical systems running in the background. But Lena watched the systems. Old habit. When you had spent years working in environments where equipment failures had consequences that didn't stay on paper, you learned to track the things that could fail. The unit sat at the far end of the primary range, roughly 1,100 yards from the firing line. It was a substantial piece of hardware, a roughly refrigerator-sized enclosure on a fixed mount that contained both the target face assembly and the feedback electronics. On the second afternoon of the exercise, Lena noticed that the unit's telemetry was producing slightly irregular readings on the range laptop. not dramatic spikes, small fluctuations in the position feedback, the kind of thing that looked like sensor drift or a calibration issue, except that the pattern of the fluctuations had a mechanical quality to it, like something internal was shifting rather than something electronic was drifting. She flagged it in her daily report to the range safety officer, a quiet, efficient captain named Tillman, who read everything she submitted and responded to perhaps 30% of it. He did not respond to this one. Friday morning, the targeting system failed completely. It didn't fail catastrophically. It wasn't a fire or an explosion, nothing that put anyone in physical danger. It simply went offline in the middle of the opening exercise, the feedback screen going black and the position readouts dropping to 0, and the entire precision marksmanship block ground to a halt, while the contractor crouched in front of the unit with a diagnostic tablet and a deepening frown. Rourke stood 15 feet away with his arms crossed and the particular expression of someone who has been inconvenienced in a way he finds personally offensive. "What's the timeline?" he asked. "Working on it," the contractor, whose name was Halverson, Lena knew from the visitor logs, said without looking up. "You've been working on it for 20 minutes. I understand that. We have a 4-hour block scheduled and I need the feedback system operational." Halverson did not respond to this. He was staring at a series of error codes on his tablet with the expression of a man who had expected different error codes. Lena was standing at the edge of the range near the medical tent, which was where she was technically supposed to be during exercises. She had a clear view of the unit from this position, and she had been watching Halverson's diagnostics with growing certainty about what he wasn't finding. "The feedback harness," she said. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. Or maybe she had. Either way, it came out clearly enough that both Halverson and Rourke turned to look at her. "Excuse me?" Rourke said. "The internal feedback harness, the wiring assembly that connects the position sensor array to the output board. It shifted, probably due to thermal expansion over the last 2 days. The connection isn't broken, it's just slightly misaligned, so it's dropping signal intermittently when the unit heats up. That's why it was reading irregular on the telemetry yesterday, and why it went offline once the ambient temperature hit the day's peak." There was a silence of about 4 full seconds. "You read the telemetry?" Halverson said. "I had access to the range laptop. I flagged it yesterday in a safety report." Halverson looked at his tablet, then at the unit, then at Lena with an expression she couldn't entirely read, but which contained a portion of what she'd call professional recalibration. Rourke's expression contained no such thing. "You're a nurse," he said. "I'm a medical contractor. I also have a background in systems observation. The mechanical issue is consistent with the telemetry pattern. The misalignment creates an intermittent disconnect that gets worse as the unit warms up. If you try to resolve it by replacing the sensor array, you'll spend several hours doing something that won't fix the problem. And you figured all of this out from where exactly? Standing over there with your clipboard?" The question had the shape of something meant to close the conversation rather than continue it. Lena had heard that shape before. The trick was deciding whether to push through it or root around it. "I'd recommend resetting the thermal coupler first before Halverson replaces anything," she said to Halverson, not to Rourke. "If I'm right about the harness, that'll be enough to restore the connection. If I'm wrong, you're out 5 minutes." Halverson looked at Rourke. Rourke's jaw tightened by a perceptible degree. "She's a nurse," Rourke said again, as though this were an argument that built with repetition. Garza, standing to Rourke's left, cleared his throat quietly. "It's 5 minutes, boss." Another silence. Rourke looked at the unit, then at Halverson, then at the sky, apparently consulting it. "Fine," he said. "Try the coupler. But when it doesn't work, we're pulling the unit and running manual scoring for the rest of the block." Halverson moved to the unit access panel and began the reset sequence. It took 4 minutes and 30 seconds. The feedback screen came back on. The position readouts populated. The telemetry stabilized at a clean signal. The range went completely quiet. Halverson stared at his tablet. Then he looked at Lena with the expression of someone updating a mental file. Rourke looked at Lena. His expression was different. It was the expression of a man who had said something he couldn't take back and had watched it become stupid in real time, and who was not grateful for the experience. "Lucky guess," he said. Lena didn't answer. She picked up her clipboard and made a notation. The incident did not make things better. If anything, it made them worse because Rourke spent the rest of Friday in the particular mood of someone who has been embarrassed by a variable they'd dismissed and cannot comfortably acknowledge what that means. He was curt with his team. He was short with Halverson. He stopped looking directly at Lena, which was a form of acknowledgement that expressed itself as erasure, the pretense that she had become less real following her inconvenient correctness. Garza found her at the ice machine outside the operations building that afternoon. "He's not usually like this," Garza said. "You don't have to explain him to me," Lena said. "I know, Garza stopped, seemed to reorganize what he'd been about to say. "That was good work. The system thing. Halverson didn't catch that." Halverson was looking at the electronics. The problem was mechanical, different training. Garza nodded. He had a thoughtful quality to him, a measured way of engaging that distinguished him from the general atmosphere of Bravo Squadron. "Where'd you learn mechanical systems?" Lena filled her cup from the ice machine. "Around." Garza accepted this. He seemed to have a good instinct for when a conversation had reached its natural perimeter. "For what it's worth," he said, "I don't think it was a lucky guess." "For what it's worth," Lena said, "neither do I." She walked back to the medical tent. The sun was dropping again, and the desert was changing color the way it did toward the end of the day. Everything moving from pale toward amber, the shadows extending, the heat beginning its slow retreat. She sat in the canvas chair outside the tent and looked at the range, at the targeting unit at the far end, standing in the long copper light, and she thought about the conversation she'd had with Rourke. She thought specifically about the way he'd said, "You're a nurse," not as a statement about her professional designation, but as a statement about her category, about the ceiling of what she could understand, what she could know, what she could do. She'd heard it before in different words, different voices, different rooms. The words were always proxies for the same thing. You are not who I'm talking to. You are not worth accounting for. You are not in the category of people whose observations mean something. She had learned over many years and across contexts that most people in this place would struggle to imagine, that the most effective response to being placed in that category was to continue operating as though the category didn't exist. Not because the category didn't have power, it did, real power, the kind that could close doors and freeze careers and make perfectly competent people invisible. But because the category was ultimately wrong, and wrong things had a way of encountering their own wrongness eventually if you kept showing up. She picked up her daily report form and started filling in the afternoon's observations. She had 3 more notations to make before the section on range safety, and the third one gave her a small pause. Because she had seen something else today, something she hadn't mentioned to Rourke or Halverson or anyone else yet. The targeting unit, even with the harness connection restored, was showing a stress fracture pattern in the feed mechanism housing that wasn't caught by the basic diagnostic. She'd noticed it in the shadow detail of the unit casing when the afternoon light hit at the right angle, a hairline separation at the housing joint, the kind of metal fatigue that built up over repeated thermal cycles. It would hold for now, probably through the weekend, but under the conditions of Monday's planned exercise, a high-volume precision block with sustained fire over several hours, it was going to fail again. And when it did, it would fail differently. She wrote the notation, attached her technical observations, and submitted the report through the secure contractor portal before the end of the day. Then she drove back to Tucson on the cracked 2-lane road with the windows down and the desert going dark around her, and she thought about Monday, and she thought about what was coming, and she knew, with the particular bone-level certainty of someone who had spent years trusting observations that were later confirmed at enormous cost, that the week was not finished surprising anyone yet. The weekend did not change Damon Rourke. Lena had not expected it to. Men like him didn't spend weekends in self-reflection. They spent them reinforcing what they already believed, training harder, running longer, doing the specific things that had built the confidence in the first place, which meant they returned Monday morning exactly as they'd left Friday afternoon, or sometimes a degree more compressed, more certain, the way heat tightens a bolt that was already set. He arrived at Hargrove at 06:30 Monday. Lena was already there. She'd been there since 5:45, which was not unusual for her. She used the early hours before the range got loud to finish her documentation and check the medical tent inventory, and more recently, to walk out to the far end of the primary range and take another look at the targeting unit in the morning light. The light at that hour was different from the afternoon, cooler, more even. the shadows falling the other direction and picking out surface details that the harsher midday glare washed flat. She stood about 20 yards from the unit and looked at it carefully. The hairline separation she'd noted Friday was still there, visible now as a slightly darker line at the housing joint where the metal had drawn apart by a fraction of a millimeter. No change from Friday, which was either reassuring or simply a pause before progression, and she couldn't tell which from visual inspection alone. What she could tell was that the planned day was going to stress it. Monday's block was the highest intensity segment of the exercise, a sustained precision fire sequence running across multiple target stations with the unit cycling through several operational modes over the course of 4+ hours. She'd read the exercise schedule in the documents Halverson had left on the range laptop, which was accessible to contractor medical personnel because nobody had changed the permissions, probably because nobody had thought about it. She filed a second technical observation note through the contractor portal at 6:15 and marked it urgent. By the time Rourke's team was staged on the firing line at 0800, she had not received a response. The morning ran without problems for the first 2 hours, which was enough time for everyone to settle into their rhythms and for the collective ambient confidence on the range to rise to the level where problems felt unlikely. Rourke was in good form. 3 of his first 5 precision shots at distance were textbook, the kind of rounds that made Halverson-type notes on his tablet with the quiet enthusiasm of someone seeing data that confirmed an expectation. Peck was running the secondary lane better than Thursday, which was noticeable, and even Garza, who was more methodical than flashy, was producing consistent results under the morning conditions. Lena sat in the canvas chair outside the medical tent and watched, and wrote her hourly observation log, and drank coffee from a thermos that had been good on Saturday and was now somewhere south of that. At 10:12, the targeting unit made a sound. It was a metallic sound, not loud, not dramatic. The kind of sound a machine makes when something internal has moved that wasn't designed to move. It lasted perhaps half a second. 2 operators heard it and looked toward the far end of the range without breaking their positions. Halverson looked up from his tablet. Lena set her coffee down. The feedback screen continued operating normally. Position readouts, signal quality, all green. Nothing on the diagnostic to indicate a problem. But Lena had heard the sound, and she knew what it meant. She stood up. Halverson walked over to his laptop and pulled the telemetry. "Readings look clean," he said, half to himself. "They won't after another heat cycle," Lena said. She was moving toward the operations area. Rourke looked at her. He'd been between shots, waiting for a lane to clear, and he had the slightly coiled quality of someone interrupted while focused. "What are you doing?" The housing separated further. That sound was the joint giving. "You need to halt the exercise." "The telemetry is fine." "The telemetry reads what the electronics report. The problem is mechanical. Same pattern as Friday, except this time the housing has opened enough that when the unit cycles into target acquisition mode under sustained fire, the vibration load is going to Vasquez." His voice had a quality she associated with walls, solid, flat, and meant to stop movement. "The telemetry is fine. Halverson, is the system operational?" Halverson looked at his tablet. He looked at the unit. He looked at Lena, and in his expression she could see the particular conflict of a technically competent person caught between what his instruments were telling him and what a person he'd been given reason to respect was telling him. And he didn't have a framework yet for how much weight to give each. "Readings are nominal," he said carefully. "Great." Rourke turned back to the firing line. "Then we continue." "You need to stop the exercise," Lena said again. Her voice had not changed in pitch or urgency. She said it the same way she'd say it in a trauma bay to someone who was about to make a problem significantly worse, calm and flat and completely certain. "You don't have operational authority here. I have range safety authority. It's in the contractor agreement." That was true. It was also the kind of technical truth that, in the hierarchy of a special operations training environment run by a senior NCO who was currently running hot, was the equivalent of showing up to an argument with a dictionary. Technically correct. Functionally ignored. "Range safety authority covers personnel safety concerns," Rourke said. "Not equipment opinions." Lena looked at him for a moment. He looked back at her. The range was quiet except for the wind coming across the scrubland from the west, which was picking up as the morning advanced. "Fine," she said. She walked back to the medical tent. She sat down in the canvas chair. She wrote in her log, 10:14. Second auditory indicators consistent with progressive housing separation on primary targeting unit. Halt recommended, declined by senior operator. See attached technical notes filed 0615. Then she watched. Rourke ran his team through 4 more precision sequences over the following 40 minutes. They were productive sequences, the kind that would look good in an after-action report, rounds on target, times within tolerance, Peck finally finding a rhythm in the secondary lane that looked like it might stick. Under other circumstances, Lena would have found professional satisfaction in watching a group of people get better at something difficult. But she was watching the unit. The thermal output was visible. Not dramatically, but the shimmer rising from the housing was slightly more pronounced than earlier, which meant the internal temperature was climbing as the unit cycled through its operational modes. She watched the housing joint. She watched the telemetry readout on Halverson's laptop, which she could see from her position, and she watched the small fluctuations beginning to appear in the position feedback data, tiny, the kind that looked like sensor noise unless you knew what you were looking for. Halverson noticed them at 10:58. She saw his posture change, a slight lean forward, a repositioning of the tablet, and she knew he was seeing the same pattern that had preceded Friday's failure. He walked over to Rourke. She watched them speak, Halverson doing more of the talking, Rourke listening with his arms crossed and his jaw set. After 30 seconds, Rourke looked at the unit, looked at Halverson, and said something short that she couldn't hear. Halverson came back to the laptop. He did not halt the exercise. At 11:04, Rourke called his team to the firing line for the high-volume sustained sequence. The most demanding operational mode of the day. Multiple operators running simultaneous lanes with the unit cycling through target acquisition and feedback at maximum rate. Lena picked up her medical bag. Not because she expected a physical injury, because she had learned over many years that the moment you decided you wouldn't need something was reliably the moment you did. The sequence started. 5 operators firing from 5 adjacent lanes, the reports overlapping into a sustained mechanical rhythm, the unit at the far end of the range cycling through its modes with the efficiency of something designed for exactly this. Telemetry holding. Halverson watching his data with the focused attention of someone hoping not to see what he was starting to see. At 11:09, the sound came again. This time, it was not subtle. It was a sharp mechanical report. Not a gunshot, not as loud, but the specific sound of structural metal giving way under load. A crack followed immediately by a grinding quality that spoke of components coming apart from each other in ways they were not designed to. The feedback screen didn't go black this time. What it did was worse. It went into a feedback loop, the position data cycling wildly, the display strobing between values as the now separated housing caused the sensor array to lose its fixed reference point. The unit itself began to emit a grinding operational sound as the targeting mechanism attempted to continue functioning with a structural component that was no longer properly seated. "Halt!" Halverson shouted. Firing stopped. The range went to the particular quiet that follows sudden noise, the specific silence of everyone processing what just happened. Rourke lowered his rifle and looked at the unit. His expression, which had been closed and certain all morning, did something complicated that she was watching from 15 yards away and couldn't entirely read. It was not quite surprise because some part of him had probably registered the possibility when Halverson came to talk to him. It was something closer to the expression of a man who has made a calculation that turned out wrong and is now in the uncomfortable position of knowing exactly when he made it. He turned and looked at Lena. She didn't say anything. She had nothing to prove by saying anything. She picked up her water bottle and took a drink and waited. Halverson was already at the unit access panel, assessing the damage. After about 45 seconds, he straightened up and called back across the range. Housing joint has separated. Internal mechanism is partially dislodged. We're looking at a replacement, not a repair. The feedback assembly is compromised. Timeline? Rourke asked. To get a replacement unit out here? If we're lucky, end of day tomorrow. The silence that followed had a particular texture. The silence of an entire training block evaporating, of schedules and deliverables and the specific pressure that senior operators feel when something goes wrong in front of a program timeline. Rourke walked toward Halverson. He walked past Lena without looking at her, which she recognized as a decision. She watched him go. Garza materialized at her left shoulder. He had a quality of appearing quietly that she'd noticed before. "You flagged this twice," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," before it happened. "Yes." Garza was quiet for a moment. He was looking at Rourke's back. "He's going to be difficult to deal with for the next hour," he said. "That seems like his problem," Lena said. "Fair enough." Garza paused. For what it's worth, Halverson told him this morning that there might be a structural issue. Rourke told him the telemetry was the ground truth. What did Halverson say to that? He said, "Yes, sir." Lena nodded. She'd worked in enough institutional structures to know that particular sequence. The technically competent person defers to the hierarchically superior person, and then the technically competent person watches the thing they warned about happen, and then everyone acts surprised. It wasn't unique to the military. It happened in hospitals, in operating rooms, in staff meetings, everywhere that hierarchy had more practical authority than expertise. She went back to the medical tent and began writing the most thorough incident documentation she had produced in 3 weeks. Rourke called a team meeting in the operations building at 11:30. Lena was not invited, which was not surprising. She sat outside in the heat, ate a protein bar, and let the sun bake the back of her neck. She was thinking through options. The unit failure meant the precision marksmanship block was suspended indefinitely. Depending on how the command chain responded to the equipment incident report, the entire exercise might be restructured. Halverson was on the phone with someone, pacing a slow circuit around his rental truck, speaking in the careful tone of someone delivering bad news to a person they'd rather not be delivering it to. At 12:15, Rourke came out of the operations building alone. He stood outside the door for a moment, one hand on the frame, looking at the range in the particular way of someone who is conducting an internal argument and hasn't reached a verdict yet. Then he walked toward Lena. She watched him come. She kept her face neutral. He stopped about 6 feet away. He was not comfortable, which she could read in the slightly forward set of his shoulders and the way he wasn't quite meeting her eyes. These were not natural postures for him. He was a man who usually occupied space with complete confidence, and the recalibration was visible. "The notation you filed this morning," he said, at 6:15. "Yes." "You flagged the housing separation before we started the exercise." "I did." "And Friday?" "The previous notation." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, looking past her right shoulder at something in the middle distance. "Halverson said the mechanical assessment in your Friday report was technically accurate, more detailed than his own diagnostic." Lena didn't respond. She'd found, over the years, that silence in these moments served better than anything she might actually say. Rourke looked at her directly for the first time in several days. "Where did you learn to read mechanical systems like that?" "Same place I learned most things," she said. "Paying attention in environments where you couldn't afford not to." "That's not an answer." "It's the one I have right now." He held her gaze for a moment, and she could see him deciding whether to push it. He was a man who pushed most things, but something in whatever calculation he was running made him stop. "The exercise is suspended," he said. "Command wants a full incident report before we proceed. Halverson's dealing with the equipment side." A pause. "I want a copy of your technical observations. The full notes, not just the portal submissions." It was not a request, technically. It had the grammatical shape of a statement of preference from someone who was accustomed to preferences being acted upon. "Send the request through Tillman," Lena said. "He's the one who has the contractor documentation chain." Rourke's jaw tightened a fraction. "I'm asking you. And I'm telling you the correct process. Captain Tillman, through the documentation chain. I'll have everything ready." Another pause, longer this time. Then he nodded, a short, minimal movement that looked like it cost him something, and walked away. Lena watched him go. Then she went back to her documentation. The afternoon brought heat and bureaucracy in approximately equal measure. Tillman arrived at 2 o'clock with a quiet efficiency, collected the incident reports, reviewed Halverson's assessment, and spent 45 minutes on a secure call that Lena was not privy to, but which resulted in Tillman's expression becoming somewhat more deliberate by the time he emerged. He found Lena at the medical tent. "Your technical observations are being forwarded to the program office," he said. "All right. The one from this morning and the one from Friday." He paused. "Your portal submissions were marked urgent." "Yes." "Neither received a response before the incident." "I'm aware." Tillman studied her with the steady, evaluating look of someone who had gotten to his position by being a good reader of situations. "Is there anything in your background documentation that I should know about?" It was a careful question, asked carefully. Lena recognized the shape of it, not accusatory, not quite investigative, but the question of someone who had started to sense that what he understood about a person on his range might be incomplete. "Nothing that would affect range safety operations," she said. "My clearance documentation is current." "It is," Tillman agreed. "I checked this morning." He paused again. "It's also somewhat more extensive than what typically accompanies a civilian medical contractor assignment." Lena said nothing. "That's not a concern," Tillman said. "Just an observation." "Noted." He held her gaze for a moment, and there was a quality in his expression that she couldn't quite categorize, something between professional assessment and a more personal curiosity, the look of someone who had encountered a discrepancy and was deciding whether it was relevant. "Good work today," he said. "Twice, apparently." He went back to the operations building. Lena sat with that for a moment. Then she began preparing the range medical tent for the following day. Equipment check, supply inventory, documentation organized in the order she'd need it if anything happened during whatever reconfigured exercise was being planned for Tuesday. The sun was moving toward the western range of mountains. The desert was beginning its late afternoon color shift. Somewhere behind the operations building, she could hear Rourke's voice. Not the words, just the cadence. The controlled edge of someone running through options they didn't like. She thought about Tillman's observation about her clearance documentation. She thought about what she hadn't told him, hadn't told anyone here, and what she had been careful not to make visible since she'd taken this assignment 3 weeks ago. She thought about the program office that was now reviewing her technical notations, and who at that level might recognize the specificity of her observations and what they might do with that recognition. And for the first time since arriving at Hargrove, Lena Vasquez felt the familiar sensation of the distance she'd been maintaining, the careful, deliberate distance between who she was at this range and who she had been before it, beginning, very quietly, to close. It wasn't panic. It wasn't anything that dramatic. It was simply the low, certain knowledge that a thing she had not decided to disclose was on the verge of disclosing itself, and that once it did, nothing about the next week was going to look like anything she'd planned. She sealed the medical tent and walked to her truck and started the engine. On the passenger seat, her phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at it. An email, forwarded from a government portal she hadn't checked in 14 months. The sender line read, "Program Office, Special Operations Medical Integration, Priority Flag." The subject line read, "Vasquez, L. Identity Verification Request, Hargrove DTR Assignment." Lena stared at the screen for 3 full seconds. Then she put the truck in gear and drove onto the access road, and the desert closed around her as the light went bronze and the mountains went to shadow. And somewhere behind her at the far end of the range, the broken targeting unit stood in the cooling air with its housing fractured open, and the only question now was whether the thing coming was something she could manage or something that had already decided not to wait for her. She didn't open the email that night. That was a decision, not an oversight. Lena was good at distinguishing between the two, between the things she hadn't gotten around to and the things she was deliberately not doing yet, giving herself the specific window of time before a thing became real that it only gets while you're still choosing not to look at it. She'd learned that skill in places where information, once received, required immediate action, and where the difference between knowing and not knowing was the difference between a plan and a crisis. She cooked dinner, rice and canned black beans and an avocado that was exactly 1 day past the edge of acceptable, and she ate at the kitchen table of the rented house in Tucson that she'd furnished with enough to be functional and not enough to suggest permanence. She washed the dish. She looked at her phone twice and set it face down both times. At 9:47, she sat on the edge of the bed and opened the email. It was 3 paragraphs. Government language, careful and technically precise, in the way of documents written to convey information without committing to what the information meant. The first paragraph referenced her contractor assignment at Hargrove Desert Training Corridor and noted that her technical incident reports had been flagged for review at the program office level. The second paragraph stated that a verification inquiry had been initiated regarding the depth and nature of her technical expertise and requested documentation supporting her contractor qualifications. The third paragraph was the one that mattered. It advised her that a representative from the Special Operations Medical Integration Office would be present at Hargrove on Wednesday morning and requested that she be available for a meeting at 0800. She read it again. Then she set the phone on the nightstand and lay back and looked at the ceiling. Wednesday was 34 hours away. The SOMIO representative. She turned that over. The Special Operations Medical Integration Office operated under a different level of the command structure than a standard training installation. Its oversight function was broader, its reach into personnel records considerably less restricted. Someone from that office coming to Hargrove was not the same as Tillman asking a careful question about clearance documentation. Someone from that office coming to Hargrove meant someone had already looked at something they weren't supposed to be able to easily find, and had found it, and had decided that what they found required a person in the room rather than a paper response. She thought about what that person would know. Then she thought about what she was going to do about it, and the answer she arrived at, after roughly 40 minutes of staring at the ceiling, was the same answer she'd arrived at every other time in her life, when the thing she'd been managing quietly had started moving toward visibility on its own. Nothing. She would do nothing differently. She would go to Hargrove in the morning. She would do her job. She would be at the meeting at 0800 on Wednesday. What happened after that was not entirely within her control, and the things outside her control were not worth burning the night over. She turned off the light and slept. Not easily, but completely. Tuesday arrived with the dust advisory and a sky the color of old concrete. The wind off the desert was moving in gusts that put fine grit into every surface and made the range feel like the inside of an argument. Lena was at Hargrove by 0600. Tillman met her at the gate. This was unusual. Tillman was typically in the operations building doing paperwork at this hour, not standing outside watching the access road. "The exercise is being restructured," he said. "While the replacement unit is in transit, Rourke requested a modified marksmanship block using manual scoring. I've approved it, with a narrower firing protocol." "What's the medical footprint?" "Same as before. You're on the range." She nodded. He fell into step beside her as she walked toward the medical tent, which told her the conversation wasn't finished. "The SOMIO inquiry," he said, after about 20 steps. "I got the email. I was informed this morning that Colonel Varadarajan will be here Wednesday, personally." Lena processed the name. Colonel Anita Varadarajan, SOMIO. She'd heard the name years ago in a context she hadn't expected to revisit. "I see," she said. "Do you know her?" A careful question, the kind with a real answer underneath it. "By reputation," Lena said. Tillman accepted this with the same measured expression he'd been deploying since Monday. "She's bringing a data analyst. They're reviewing the full technical observation file and the original incident reports." He paused. "And your contractor application materials." "That's within their authority." "It is." He stopped walking. "Vasquez." He used her name with a weight that indicated they were moving out of procedural conversation. "If there's something in your background that's going to surface in that meeting, something that affects the current assignment or this team, I'd rather know before 8 o'clock Wednesday than during it." She stopped too. She looked at him straight because he deserved that. "There's nothing that affects range safety or puts this team at risk," she said. "That's not quite what I asked." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She held his gaze. "I'll be at the meeting." He looked at her for a moment longer, and she could see him deciding whether to push further and deciding not to. He was a good officer. Good officers knew when a door was closed from the inside and understood that forcing it had consequences that outlasted the information gained. 0800 Wednesday, he said. "I'll be there." He walked toward the operations building. Lena continued to the medical tent. She set her bag down, ran through the opening inventory, and listened to the wind-scraping grit across the canvas. Rourke's modified exercise started at 0830 and immediately had the energy of something operating under controlled frustration. Without the targeting unit's automated feedback system, the team was running old-school manual scoring, a range safety officer at the target end with binoculars and a radio, reading impacts and calling results back to the firing line. It was slower, less data-rich, and Rourke's dissatisfaction with the pace was a visible quality in the set of his shoulders and the clipped efficiency of his communications with the team. But he ran it professionally, which Lena noted. Whatever he was feeling about the situation, he didn't let it degrade the exercise. That was the complicated thing about him that she'd been negotiating since the first day. His fundamental competence kept reasserting itself through the arrogance, like bedrock showing through eroded soil. Garza was running the primary lane. I was in a prone position, rifle settled, and Lena watched from her position as he ran through his pre-shot sequence with the methodical patience that characterized everything he did. The wind was the complicating factor today, gusting and variable, the kind that made long-range work a conversation between the shooter and an unpredictable variable. At 9:50, Peck took a round to the face. Not a bullet, a brass casing ejected from Garza's rifle on a gust that caught it wrong and sent it backward along the firing line instead of to the side. It was a small piece of brass traveling fast, and it caught Peck below his eye on the orbital ridge. A half-inch laceration, immediate bleeding, the kind of wound that looked worse than it was because facial injuries bled disproportionately, but that was still a wound requiring attention. Peck went to a knee. "I'm good," he said, which was what people always said in the first 3 seconds. Lena was already moving. She covered the distance to the firing line in about 12 seconds, had her kit open and gloves on in another 8, and was applying pressure to the wound while Peck was still deciding whether he was going to admit it hurt. He was 23 or 4, she guessed, with the particular combination of toughness and transparency that young operators had before they'd had enough time to fully separate performance from reality. "Hold still," she said. "It's fine." "I know. Hold still anyway." The laceration was about 1.5 centimeters, clean edges, no orbital involvement. She ran her fingers carefully along the bone to check, and Peck winced, but the structure was intact. Bleeding was slowing already. She cleaned it, applied steri strips rather than full closure, put a pressure dressing over it. "You'll want this looked at by a physician for possible sutures," she said. "Today, not tomorrow. We have an exercise. You have a laceration next to your eye socket. Those 2 facts exist simultaneously." She heard someone behind her. Rourke. She recognized the footfall cadence by now. 3 weeks of the same boots on the same terrain. "Status?" he said. "Laceration, facial, non-critical. Needs physician evaluation today for potential sutures. He can continue the exercise if he chooses, but I'd recommend against sustained prone shooting. Pressure changes, how that bleeds." Rourke crouched beside Peck. "How's the vision?" "Fine. It's just..." Peck gestured at the dressing on his face with an expression that combined irritation and something she read as embarrassment, the particular mortification of being injured by something trivially small in front of people whose respect you were still working to earn. "You're going to sick call after this block," Rourke said. Not unkindly, just settled. He looked at Lena. "Good response time." It was not an apology. It was not an acknowledgement of Monday or Friday or any of the preceding friction. It was what it was, a professional noting a professional fact, in the clipped, limited vocabulary of someone who wasn't ready to make the sentence longer than it needed to be. "I'll write up the incident report," Lena said. She stood. She went back to her position. She documented the injury, the response time, the treatment, the recommendation, and the nature of the contributing factor, and she did it without editorialism, because the incident report was not the place for that. The exercise continued. The wind kept blowing. But the replacement targeting unit arrived at 1400 in the back of a contractor's van, and the energy on the range shifted immediately. The specific relief of a plan recovering from a disruption, the collective exhale of people who'd been working around a problem suddenly having the problem removed. Halverson supervised the installation with the efficiency of someone who had thought carefully about not repeating his previous week, running a full mechanical inspection of the housing assembly before the first electronic connection was made. Lena watched him work. He was good, she'd concluded. Not naturally inclined toward the mechanical observations she made instinctively, but responsive to information when he had it, and genuinely rigorous in his process. He'd been different toward her since Monday. Not warm exactly, but with a quality of attention that treated her observations as data rather than noise. "Can I ask you something?" he said, without looking up from the housing inspection. "I was checking the joint with a calibration tool, reading the torque values with a precision that reflected some absorbed lesson." "Sure." "Friday, the telemetry pattern. You saw that and immediately interpreted it as mechanical rather than electronic." He looked up. "That's not standard medical training." "No," she agreed. It's not standard contractor training either. Also, no. He went back to the inspection. A pause. You don't have to tell me, he said. It's a good read. It would have saved us a day and a half if someone had listened earlier. Yes, Lena said. It would have. He caught the understated precision of that and had the decency not to respond to it. He finished the inspection, declared the housing within tolerance, and began the electronic integration. At 16:30, the new unit came online clean. Halverson ran through the diagnostic sequence twice and found nothing concerning. The range went back to operational status. Rourke called a full team debrief at 1700. Lena was not included, which was standard. She packed the medical tent in the declining light, ran the end-of-day inventory, and thought about Wednesday. About Colonel Varadarajan. About what a Somio colonel would see in a contractor file with an unusually extensive clearance record and a pattern of technical observations that didn't match the job description. She was still thinking about it when Garza appeared at the tent. Rourke wants to know if you're available for a range run tomorrow morning, he said. 0700, before the main exercise. That was unexpected enough that she let a half-beat of silence exist before responding. A range run. He wants to run the new unit through a stress sequence before the main block. Garza paused, choosing words with his characteristic care. He's being methodical about the equipment prep. She understood what Garza wasn't saying, which was that Rourke was doing the thing that careful people do after they've been caught by a variable they dismissed, overcorrecting toward thoroughness, trying to rebuild the sense of control through process. I'll be there, she said. Garza nodded and left. Lena drove back to Tucson in the dusty evening, and the mountains were rust-colored and the sky above them was a deep, flat blue that would be black by the time she reached the city. She thought about control and the illusion of it, and how the best you could do sometimes was show up and know what you knew and let the rest arrive when it arrived. Wednesday morning was clear. The dust from Tuesday had settled overnight, and the desert came back to its baseline, the clean emptiness of a place that didn't accumulate, that let the wind take everything eventually. She arrived at 0645. Rourke was already there, alone, standing at the firing line with his rifle and a data notebook, running through a manual wind calculation with the focused stillness of someone not interested in being interrupted. She set up the medical tent and left him to it. By 0715, 4 other team members had arrived and the range run began. Halverson monitored the new unit's telemetry with a thoroughness that was visibly more anxious than his previous work. The unit performed cleanly. Rourke ran 2 precision sequences and noted the results in his notebook in handwriting that was small and exact. At 0750, a vehicle turned onto the access road that Lena didn't recognize. Black, government plates. A Suburban, moving at the unhurried pace of official transit. It pulled to the area near the operations building and stopped. 2 people got out. A data analyst type, young, carrying a hard case and a laptop bag, moving with the economical efficiency of someone whose job was to process information and not get in the way of people making decisions. And a woman who was not young, who moved with the quality of someone who had been in rooms where decisions were made for long enough that her body had incorporated the posture of it without effort or intention. Colonel Anita Varadarajan was shorter than Lena had pictured. She was maybe 55, with close-cropped gray hair and a face that had the particular configuration of someone who had spent many years listening carefully and revealing very little. She wore a civilian suit. The Somio office often deployed in civilian clothes for training environment visits. And she walked toward the operations building without looking at the range. Then she stopped. She looked at the range. She looked at the firing line. She looked at the figure by the medical tent. Lena did not look away. Varadarajan changed course and walked toward the medical tent. She did not move quickly, but she moved with the directional certainty of someone who had decided on something. Tillman appeared from the operations building and fell in behind her, which meant he'd been watching the access road. Rourke had paused his exercise and was watching. Garza was watching. The entire range had the quality of a stage with everyone frozen mid-action. Varadarajan stopped 6 feet from Lena. She looked at her for a long moment, a specific kind of look, recognition working through confirmation rather than surprise, the look of someone who had done enough research that the face matched the file, but was still absorbing the context of finding it here, like this, in a medical tent outside a training range in the Arizona desert. Sergeant Major Vasquez, she said. The title hit the desert air and just stayed there. Lena heard Rourke take a step behind her. She heard Tillman stop moving entirely. The wind was the only sound for a full 3 seconds. I've been a civilian contractor for 14 months, Colonel, Lena said. I'm aware of your separation date. Varadarajan didn't look away from her face. I'm also aware of your service record, which is why I found it remarkable that you were submitting technical observations on a precision targeting system from a medical contractor position. She paused. 17 years of classified special operations service, Sergeant Major. 4 combat deployments, 3 ARSOF integration tours, and a level of marksmanship qualification that puts you in a very specific category of personnel. The desert was completely silent. Lena could feel Rourke behind her the way you feel weather that hasn't arrived yet. And your technical observations, Varadarajan continued, not only correctly diagnosed a mechanical failure that a certified systems contractor missed, but also prevented what my analyst has assessed would have been a significant equipment loss and potential range safety incident. The incident happened anyway, Lena said. The halt was refused. I know, I've read the full documentation chain. Varadarajan's voice had not changed temperature through any of this, which Lena recognized as its own form of precision. I'm here because Somio has been authorized to brief you on a program that your specific skill set is relevant to, and because the Commanding General of Special Operations Command Southwest would like to speak with you. Lena went very still. General Harwick, Varadarajan said, is at Fort Aldrin. He would like a meeting, in person. Lena processed this. She processed what it meant, what it preceded, what it would cost, and what it might require. She processed the 14 months she'd spent in this contractor role doing a fraction of what she was capable of, and the reasons those 14 months had made sense to her at the time, and whether those reasons still held the same weight they had when she'd constructed them. Behind her, she heard Rourke, quiet, for once completely quiet, not moving, not speaking, standing in the full weight of what he'd just heard. She looked at Varadarajan. When? She asked. Varadarajan reached into her jacket pocket and produced an envelope, sealed, hand-delivered, the physical formality of something that had been decided at a level above this conversation. This morning, she said, a transport is waiting at Davis-Monthan. Lena took the envelope. She felt its weight, which was not the weight of paper. It was the weight of the things inside it that she hadn't chosen yet, that were waiting for her to decide whether she was still the person who could carry them. She looked at the range, the new targeting unit standing clean in the morning light, the firing line, the desert extending past the last berm into the flat open country beyond. She looked at Halverson, who was staring at her with an expression she didn't have time to interpret. She looked at Garza, who met her eyes with the specific calm of someone who had suspected something without knowing what, and had now received confirmation that he hadn't suspected enough. She looked at Rourke. He was standing very still, 10 feet behind her, with his rifle in his right hand and his left hand open at his side. His face had the expression of a man who had built a complete picture of a person and is standing in the moment of understanding that he built it out of the wrong materials, and that the picture is not wrong in a small way. It is wrong in a way that reaches back through every interaction and recasts it, and there is no adjustment available. There is only the full understanding of the error and what it means. He didn't speak. She didn't make him. She turned back to Varadarajan. Give me 10 minutes to brief the range safety officer on medical coverage. Of course, Varadarajan said. Lena walked to where Tillman was standing. He had not moved. His expression was that of a man who had asked the right question 48 hours ago and had received a limited answer and was now seeing the full answer and processing the distance between them. I need to designate emergency medical coverage for the remainder of the exercise, she said. Halverson is first aid certified. I've reviewed his card. He can cover basic response until a replacement contractor is dispatched. I'll submit the formal handover before I leave. Tillman blinked. Vasquez. Tillman. She kept her voice even. The range needs medical coverage. That's the immediate priority. Everything else can wait until the coverage is in place. He absorbed this. He nodded. I'll make the call. She went back to the medical tent. She spent 8 minutes doing a formal handover inventory, documenting the kit contents, marking the emergency protocols in the log, writing a clear transition note for whoever came in after her. She did it completely, because leaving a job half done was not something she was capable of, regardless of what was happening around it. When she zipped the medical bag and straightened up, Rourke was standing 6 feet away. She hadn't heard him come up. He was quiet when he chose to be, which was its own form of information. "Sergeant Major," he said. The title sounded different in his voice than it had in Varadarajan's. It had the weight of something being used for the first time, something he was testing to see if it held, knowing it would. "I'm a civilian contractor," she said. "You were." She picked up her bag. She looked at him. He looked like a man on the other side of something, which was where she'd been putting him mentally for 3 weeks, and which was, she recognized, not entirely fair. "The harness call," he said. "Friday. The housing on Monday. Everything you filed. Yes. You've done this before. Not medical contracting. The other thing." 17 years, she said, give or take. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the range between them, carrying grit, carrying distance. "I told you it was a lucky guess," he said. "You did." "It wasn't." "No," she said. "It wasn't." He held her gaze and she held his, and in his expression there was something she hadn't seen on him before. Not guilt exactly, not shame, those were too simple for what was in his face. It was more like the specific discomfort of someone encountering the full extent of their error from the inside, which is always worse than encountering it from the outside because there is nowhere to redirect it. "The meeting," he said, "with General Harwick. What does that mean?" Lena looked at the envelope in her hand. She thought about what was inside it, what the transport waiting at Davis Monthan meant, what Somio's involvement at this level meant, and what General Harwick would say to her when she walked into the room. She thought about 14 months of deliberate invisibility, and how visibility had arrived anyway. "I don't know yet," she said. She walked past Rourke toward the suburban where Varadarajan was waiting, and the desert stretched out around Hargrove in every direction, and the new targeting unit stood clean and functional at the far end of the range. And behind her she heard Rourke say something. Not to her, quietly, mostly to himself. And she didn't turn to hear it, but she thought she understood what it was, and it was not nothing, and the envelope in her hand felt heavier with every step she took toward whatever had already been decided. The Suburban smelled like recycled air and government-issue upholstery cleaner, and Lena sat in the back with the envelope on her knee and watched the desert go past the window and tried not to think about what was in it. She failed at that within the first 4 minutes, opened it, and read. The letter was 2 pages, printed on SOCOM Southwest letterhead with General Marcus Harwick's signature at the bottom, a signature she recognized from documents she hadn't seen in 14 months and had not expected to see again. The first page was operational language, formal notification that Somio Review had identified her contractor assignment as relevant to an ongoing program evaluation, request for voluntary consultation, standard waiver of certain separation agreement limitations for the purpose of the meeting. All technically correct, all carefully worded to give her an exit if she wanted one. The second page was not operational language. It was a paragraph written in a register she recognized as Harwick's actual voice rather than his staff's interpretation of it. She'd read enough of his operational assessments during her last 2 years of service to know the difference. It said that Somio had been reviewing the integration of advanced medical personnel in special operations training environments and had identified a structural gap. It said that the gap was producing outcomes, specifically the kind of preventable incidents and missed observations that showed up in after-action reports as equipment failures rather than personnel failures, that the command was no longer willing to accept. It said that her name had come up in this context not because of the contractor file, but because of a recommendation submitted 14 months ago by someone she had worked with, someone who had argued at the time that her separation was a loss the command would eventually feel. She didn't know who had submitted that recommendation. She thought she might be able to guess. She folded the letter back into the envelope and looked at the desert moving past and did not say anything for a long time. Varadarajan was in the front passenger seat. She had not attempted conversation since they'd left Hargrove, which Lena had taken as a form of professional consideration, giving her the time to read and process without commentary. The analyst, whose name was briefly mentioned as Kwan, was working on his laptop with the focused detachment of someone whose job began after the human conversations ended. "The gap Somio identified," Lena said. "How long has it been in the evaluation?" Varadarajan half turned. About 8 months. Before or after the Hargrove assignment? Before. The assignment wasn't designed to surface anything. It was a routine contractor placement. And yet, Varadarajan agreed. She had a quality of precision in conversation that Lena respected. She didn't over-explain, didn't editorialize, let the facts carry what they could carry. The recommendation in the letter, the one submitted 14 months ago. I don't suppose you're in a position to tell me who submitted it. A pause that was itself a form of answer. That's a conversation for General Harwick. Lena nodded. She looked back out the window. Davis-Monthan Air Force Base was visible now on the approach. The flight line, the rows of aircraft, the particular organized density of a major installation. She had not been on a military base in 14 months, and she had not understood until this moment exactly how much she had been aware of that. Fort Aldrin was 90 minutes by transport aircraft, a quick flight northeast that put them on the ground in the early afternoon. The base was larger than Hargrove by an order of magnitude, a full special operations installation with the layered security and institutional weight of a place that had been doing important things for long enough that the importance was embedded in the infrastructure. General Marcus Harwick's office was on the second floor of the operations complex. She'd never been to this specific installation, but the office looked like every senior general's office she'd seen. Efficient, deliberately not impressive, the kind of space that communicated that the person who used it was not concerned with communicating anything through their surroundings. Harwick was 60, or close to it. He was a lean man with close-cropped gray hair and the specific physical economy of someone who had spent decades moving through environments where efficiency of movement was not a preference but a survival trait. He stood when she entered, which was either courtesy or a signal, and she filed both possibilities. "Sergeant Major," he said. "General." She didn't correct the title this time. He gestured to a chair and she sat. Varadarajan positioned herself near the wall. Kwan did not come in. Harwick looked at her with the direct assessment of someone for whom reading people quickly was not a skill but a continuous practice. "You've read the letter." "Yes, sir." "Then you know why you're here." "I have a reasonable outline," she said. "I'd prefer the details." He nodded. He sat back in his chair with the ease of a man completely comfortable in his authority, not performing it, just inhabiting it, which was the more effective version. Somio has been evaluating a structural issue in how we integrate medical expertise into advanced training environments. The specific problem is this. We consistently underutilize the tactical observation capacity of personnel with combined medical and combat backgrounds because we sort them into medical roles and treat those roles as separate from operational assessment. He paused. The Hargrove incident, both the equipment failure and the documentation pattern preceding it, is being used as a case study because it illustrates the gap precisely. "I filed the reports through the correct channels," Lena said. "You did, and they were ignored until something broke." He held her gaze. "That's the problem we're trying to fix." She absorbed this. "The consultation. What does it involve?" "We're building a framework for a new integration role. Senior medical personnel with special operations backgrounds assigned to training environments with formal authority to flag tactical and equipment concerns. Not as an adjunct to operations, but as a recognized part of the oversight structure." He paused. "We want your input on the design, and we want to discuss the possibility of you leading the pilot program." The room was quiet. Through the window, she could hear the distant sound of the installation, vehicles, the far-off percussion of something on a range. She thought about the canvas chair outside the medical tent at Hargrove, the granola bar, the cracked two-lane road back to Tucson, the deliberate smallness she had constructed around herself for 14 months. "Why now?" she said. "The separation was clean. I signed the agreements." Harwick's expression shifted by a small degree, something coming into it that was not quite personal but was adjacent. "Because the recommendation I mentioned was compelling, and because the person who submitted it made an argument I couldn't permanently ignore." He picked up a folder from his desk and placed it in front of her. "And because 3 weeks ago, a civilian medical contractor at Hargrove Desert Training Corridor filed 2 technically precise incident reports about a precision targeting system using observation methodology that isn't taught in contractor certification courses, and submitted them urgently through the correct channels, and was ignored, and was proven entirely right, twice." She looked at the folder. She didn't open it yet. "The recommendation," she said again. 14 months ago. Harwick looked at her steadily. Sergeant Major Delia Okafor. Lena went still. She hadn't expected that name, and the surprise was real. The specific surprise of being incorrect about something you'd been certain about. Okafor. She turned the name over. Delia Okafor, who had been her team's senior NCO for 3 years on the last deployment, who had been the person standing next to her on the worst day of that deployment, who had not, at any point in the 14 months since, made any contact. "She filed a formal recommendation," Lena said. 14 pages, Harwick said, single-spaced. "She argued that your separation was premature, that the circumstances that led to it were a structural failure of command, not a failure of performance, and that the loss of your specific capability set would create a gap that would take years to understand." He paused. She was not wrong. Lena looked at the folder. Then she opened it. She spent 2 hours in that office, and the folder was only the beginning of it. The first hour was Harwick and Varadarajan walking her through the SOMIO program framework, the structural design, the operational parameters, the chain of authority that would give the new integration role actual standing rather than the contractor-level advisory status that had meant her reports went into the portal and waited for responses that didn't come. She asked questions. They were specific questions, the kind that came from understanding what the practical problems were, and Harwick answered them with the same directness he'd deployed from the moment she'd walked in. The second hour was harder. The second hour was about the circumstances of her separation. She had not expected them to open that. The separation had been documented as voluntary. She had signed the papers, she had processed out, she had moved to Tucson and taken the contractor certification course and built the small, controlled, functional life that asked nothing of her that she wasn't willing to give. The record said voluntary, and she had understood that the record was a negotiated thing, a version of events that served multiple interests, and she had accepted it because the alternative, the accurate version, the one that documented what had actually happened on the third day of the Calderon Valley operation, would have required her to expose people she wasn't willing to expose, even people who had not, in the end, protected her. But Harwick had the accurate version. She understood this when he set a second folder on the desk, a thinner one, with a classification marking she hadn't expected to see, and said, "The Calderon Valley AAR. The original, not the redacted version." She looked at it without touching it. "How?" she said. "Okafor," Harwick said. "She kept copies. She submitted them with the recommendation." Lena sat with that. The full weight of what Delia Okafor had done, the risk of it, the deliberate 14-month-later act of surfacing something that multiple people had agreed to submerge, settled on her with the specific gravity of something you hadn't asked for and couldn't give back. "The individuals named in the original AAR," she said carefully, "are being reviewed," Harwick said. His voice had lost none of its directness. "That review is not why you're here today. It's a separate process, and it's being handled through appropriate channels. But it's happening." He looked at her. "The record of your separation is also being reviewed, with an eye toward correction." She absorbed this. Correction. A word that contained considerable weight when applied to a service record. It meant formal amendment, official acknowledgement, the institutional act of saying, "This is not what we said, this is what actually happened." "I don't need a correction," she said. "I know you don't need it," Harwick said. "The question is whether it's accurate." She looked at the thin folder. "Yes," she said. "It's accurate." "Then it gets corrected." He said it with the finality of a decision made before she walked in, which it was. "The question I need you to answer is whether you're willing to engage with what comes after the correction." She looked at him. "The pilot program." Among other things. She thought about Hargrove, about Rourke's face when Varadarajan said the title, about Peck's laceration and the targeting unit and the 45 seconds Halverson had needed to confirm what she'd already told them. She thought about this portal report marked urgent that had sat unread until something broke. "I need a week," she said. Harwick nodded. "You have it." She flew back to Tucson alone. Varadarajan and Kwan stayed at Fort Aldrin. The transport dropped her at Davis-Monthan, and she drove back to the rented house in the bronze late afternoon light, the same desert, the same road, but nothing exactly the same about it. She called Delia Okafor that evening. The phone rang 4 times, and then, I wondered how long it would take you to call. Okafor's voice was exactly as she remembered it. The particular dryness of someone who had found a way to find most situations slightly less serious than other people were treating them, which was its own form of operational steadiness. 14 pages, Lena said. 14 and a half. They cut the last paragraph. A pause. I know you didn't ask me to do it. No. I know you're probably annoyed. She stopped. She sat down on the couch in the furnished house and looked at the ceiling. No, I'm not annoyed. Good. Because I wrote it before you'd finished processing out, and I've been sitting on it for 8 months trying to decide whether to submit it, and I decided. So, why 8 months? Because I was waiting to see if you'd find your way back on your own, and you were doing that thing you do where you make yourself smaller than you are and call it a choice. Lena was quiet for a moment. Calderon Valley. Yes. You kept the documentation. I kept everything. Okafor's voice had lost the dryness. It was flat now and certain, and carried the specific weight of someone who had made a decision about what they owed to the accurate record of events. What happened to you in that valley was wrong, Lena. The way it was documented was wrong. I wasn't willing to let it stay the way it was written. She didn't say anything for a while. The house was quiet around her. Harwick said the review is happening, she said finally. I know. I've been briefed. The people named are going to have a difficult few months, Okafor said, as they should. Lena thought about those people, thought about the specific faces, the specific decisions made in a specific room at a specific point in an operation, and the documentation that had followed. She'd made her peace with it, or believed she had. She was less certain now that peace and acceptance were the same thing. The program, she said, Harwick's program. You know about it. I know what it is. I think you should do it. You're not going to tell me why? Because you already know why, Okafor said. You just needed someone to make it impossible to keep ignoring. She drove to Hargrove Thursday morning without a specific plan, which was unusual for her. She drove because the alternative was sitting in the rented house thinking, and she'd done enough of that, and she wanted to see the range in the clean morning light and make a decision about what she was going to do with the next chapter of her life, in a place that had, in its imperfect and frustrating way, reminded her what she was. The gate guard waved her through without question. Her contractor badge still worked. The range was running, Bravo Squadron visible on the firing line, the new targeting unit green at the far end, the desert quiet beyond the last berm. She parked near the medical tent, which had a replacement contractor in it. A young man named Foster, who she'd never met, who looked up at her approach with the mild alarm of someone encountering an unexpected variable. I'm not replacing you, she told him, just visiting. He relaxed approximately 40%. She went to stand at the edge of the range. Rourke noticed her within 30 seconds. He had that quality, situational awareness that wasn't surveillance, just the continuous background reading of an environment that had been trained into him over years. He finished the sequence he was running, handed his rifle to Peck, and walked toward her. He looked tired. Not physically. Physically, he looked exactly the same, tired in a different way, the specific tiredness of someone who had been thinking hard about something that didn't resolve easily. You came back, he said. Visiting. He stood beside her and they both looked at the range. The wind was light this morning, coming from the southwest, carrying the smell of dry grass and distance. I owe you an apology, he said. She waited. A real one, he said, which told her he'd been working on the distinction between a real one and the other kind. Not for the equipment thing, not for being wrong about the technical call, for the way I treated you from the first day, He stopped. Restarted. I put you in a category and I operated from the category instead of from the person. That's the kind of mistake I would chew out a junior operator for making, and I made it. He paused. I made it for 3 weeks. Lena looked at the targeting unit at the far end of the range, standing in the morning light. Yes, she said. You did. That's it? You asked for an apology, not an absolution. He absorbed that. Fair, he said. The range continued around them. Garza was running a precision sequence, patient and methodical, the same qualities on the firing line that he brought to every other part of his functioning. Peck was at the secondary lane,
moving better than he had on Monday, the dressing on his face reduced now to a small adhesive strip. Varadarajan told Tillman what the meeting was about, Rourke said, before she left. The program. Harwick. That was her call to make. Calderon Valley.
He said it carefully, like a word in a language he was learning. I don't know what that is, but I know it matters. Yes. Is it? Are you able to? No, she said. He nodded. He didn't push. The pilot program. The integration role. He paused. Are you going to take it? She hadn't answered that question yet. Not to Harwick, not to herself. She'd been carrying it for 36 hours like a stone in a pocket, aware of its weight without examining it directly. She looked at the range. She thought about what it had felt like to sit outside the medical tent and watch reports go unread. To be told it was a lucky guess. To hear you're a nurse wielded as a perimeter rather than a description. And she thought about Peck's laceration and Halverson's recalibrated attention and Garza's careful presence at the ice machine, and even Rourke standing there now, imperfect and accountable, in a way that was more honest than his previous certainty had ever been. I don't know yet, she said. It was the truth. He seemed to understand it as such. They stood at the edge of the range for another minute, and the wind moved across the desert between them, and the targeting unit held its position at the far end of the range. And somewhere on the firing line, Garza sent a round downrange that found exactly where it was supposed to go. The formal review process began the following Tuesday. It was initiated through SOMIO, which had jurisdictional reach across the specific personnel categories involved, and it proceeded with the particular momentum of institutional processes that have been waiting for authorization. Slow to start, then rapid, with the gathering force of something that had been damned for a long time. Lena was not directly involved in the review. She was a subject of one portion of it, and the procedural separation between the two roles was maintained with care. But she heard things. Okafor kept her informed within limits. Varadarajan, in a brief call Wednesday afternoon, told her that the original Calderon Valley documentation had been formally entered into the review record and that the individuals named in it had been notified. She thought about those notifications, about the people receiving them and understanding, for the first time, that the version of events they had relied upon for 14 months was no longer the only version in official circulation, that the accurate record had surfaced and was now moving through the system with all the weight that accurate records carry when they've been deliberately suppressed and then recovered. That weight was considerable. She went for a run Thursday morning, 6 miles on the flat road outside Tucson as the sun was rising, and she thought about accountability, what it looked like when it arrived at scale, at the institutional level, rather than the individual level. She'd spent 14 months thinking about it at the individual level, asking herself what it meant for her specifically, what she'd lost and what she'd preserved, and what the correct posture was toward the people who'd made the decisions they'd made in Calderon Valley. Those were real questions, and she didn't have complete answers to all of them. But there was a different question now, one that hadn't existed 14 months ago, because the circumstances that created it hadn't existed. What did she owe to the gap? The structural gap that Harwick had described, the one that had produced 3 weeks of ignored reports and a targeting unit damaged past the point of repair. The one that would keep producing those outcomes in different forms, at different ranges, until someone with the right background and the right formal authority was in the right role to prevent it. She ran 6 miles and didn't fully answer the question. Then she drove to Fort Aldrin. She hadn't called ahead. She'd considered it and decided against it because calling ahead meant preparing a presentation, and she didn't want to present, she wanted to decide, and the decision needed to happen in the room rather than on the way to it. Harwick's aide looked at her with the expression of someone who had not been expecting her. "I need 10 minutes with the general," she said. The aide made a call. 3 minutes later, she was in the office. Harwick looked at her without apparent surprise. He had the quality of someone who operated from a deep assumption that things would happen when they were ready to happen, and that showing up unannounced was not a category of event that required special response. "You have an answer," he said. "Yes, sir." "And?" She sat down. She thought about the canvas chair outside the medical tent, and the cracked 2-lane road, and the contractor badge on the lanyard, and the portal report marked urgent that had sat unread. And she thought about everything those 14 months had been, and everything they hadn't. "I'll lead the pilot program," she said, "on conditions." Harwick leaned forward slightly. Name them. The integration role has to have operational standing, not advisory standing. If I flag something, there's a formal protocol for response. Not a recommendation, a requirement. Agreed. The personnel assigned to the program have independent documentation authority. Chain of report goes above the installation command level, directly to Somio. We've already drafted that provision. And the service record correction is completed before I begin. Not concurrent. Before. Harwick looked at her for a moment. That's going to take approximately 3 weeks. I know. You can wait 3 weeks. I've waited 14 months, she said. 3 weeks is nothing. He held her gaze and something moved in his expression. Not softness, not sentiment, something more durable than either. The specific recognition of someone who has made an error of institutional judgment and is watching the cost of it arrive in the form of a person who had not let the error make her smaller, only quieter, only for a time. Done, he said. All 3. She nodded. She stood. She was almost at the door when he said, "The recommendation, from Sergeant Major Okafor. She described you in a specific way that I thought about for a long time before I was in a position to act on it." She stopped. "She wrote that you were the most operationally precise person she'd ever served with," he said, "and that the thing that made you precise was not the training or the deployments or the qualifications. She said it was that you paid attention to the things other people decided weren't worth noticing, and that you were always right about which things mattered." Lena stood in the doorway. "She was generous," Lena said. "She was accurate," Harwick said. Lena walked out of the office and down the corridor and out into the Fort Aldrin afternoon, which was bright and dry and carried the smell of aviation fuel and cut grass and the particular quality of a place where serious things were decided. And she stood outside for a moment and let the sun hit her face and thought, 3 weeks. 3 weeks, and then the record would say what it was supposed to say. 3 weeks, and then the role would exist with the authority it was supposed to have. 3 weeks, and then she would stop being the woman who sat in a canvas chair outside a tent and watched her reports go unread. She was walking to the car when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. An unknown number, blocked, which on its own was not unusual. But the message that followed was a single line, no identifier, no context, the kind of message that was sent by someone who knew she'd have enough background to understand it without explanation. The Calderon Valley Review just expanded. They found the secondary documentation. "There are 2 more names you don't know about. One of them is currently at Fort Aldrin." She stood in the parking lot with the phone in her hand and the afternoon sun on the concrete around her, and she read the message again, and she looked at the operations complex behind her, and she thought about what currently at Fort Aldrin meant in the context of a formal review process that had just expanded, and she thought about who had sent the message, and why now, and whether it was warning her or informing her or both. And the distance between those things suddenly felt very small. She read the message a 3rd time and then put the phone in her pocket and stood very still for about 15 seconds, which was how long it took her to move from the immediate reaction. The cold, specific alertness that comes when a situation reveals a dimension you hadn't accounted for, into something more functional, currently at Fort Aldrin. She turned and looked at the operations complex. The building was a long 2-story structure, tan concrete and tinted glass, unremarkable from the outside in the way that places where serious things happened were often unremarkable from the outside. Harwick's office was on the 2nd floor, 2nd window from the east end. She could see the window from where she stood. She thought about the message, the secondary documentation, whatever that meant specifically. She could construct a working theory, because Calderon Valley had not been a simple operation, and its documentation had not been simple either, and if Okafor had kept copies of the primary record, there was a reasonable possibility that she had kept everything, including the materials that existed adjacent to the formal AAR, the communications and the briefing records, and the things that had been produced in the course of the operation but hadn't made it into the version that got filed. 2 more names she didn't know about. She'd thought she knew the full shape of what had happened. She'd spent 14 months operating on the assumption that she understood the complete architecture of the decisions made in Calderon Valley. The message was telling her that her architecture was incomplete, and that the incomplete portion was not abstract. It was present, physically, in the same installation she was standing in front of. She took out her phone and called Okafor. It rang twice. "You got a message," Okafor said. Not a question. "Yes, did you send it?" "No." A pause. But I know who did. Tell me. Kwan, the analyst Varadrajan brought to Hargrove. He's been working the documentation review since Tuesday, and he found something in the signal traffic from the third day of the operation. Something that wasn't in what I submitted because I didn't have it. What did he find? Okafor was quiet for a moment in a way that meant she was deciding how much to say on an open line. A routing record shows that the decision to restrict the original AAR didn't originate at the level everyone assumed. There was a communication upstream before the restriction order that came from. She stopped. Lena, you should hear this from Harwick. In person. Go back in. One of the names is at Fort Aldrin right now. I know. Do you know who? Another silence, this one longer. Colonel Brant Selwyn. He's here for a logistics conference. It's been on the installation calendar for 6 weeks. Nobody flagged it as significant until Kwan found the routing record this morning. Selwyn. She turned the name over. Brant Selwyn had been, at the time of Calderon Valley, a lieutenant colonel in a planning role. Not a field operator, an administrative function, the kind of position that shaped operations through resource allocation and documentation rather than direct command. She'd never had a direct professional relationship with him. He had been, in her understanding, peripheral to what happened. The routing record was telling Kwan he wasn't peripheral. Go back in, Okafor said again. Varadarajan is already with Harwick. They got the same information you did, probably 5 minutes earlier. Lena was already walking toward the entrance. What? The aide looked significantly more stressed when she came back through the door. He was on the phone, and he held up one finger and then reconsidered, apparently deciding that the one finger was the wrong move given whatever was happening in the building behind him, and said into the phone, "Hold," and then to Lena, "The general is expecting you. 2nd floor." She took the stairs. The corridor on the 2nd floor had a different atmosphere than it had 40 minutes ago, a quality of accelerated purpose, people moving with the specific urgency of a situation that has changed faster than the response plan for it. Varadarajan was outside Harwick's office door talking to Kwan in a low, rapid exchange that stopped when Lena appeared. Varadarajan looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprised. She was not a person who surprised easily, but contained the acknowledgement that the timeline had compressed in ways that required adjustment. "You got Kwan's message," she said. "Yes. Okafor told me the name." Something moved in Varadarajan's expression. Selwyn's presence here is not related to the review. It was a scheduled logistics conference that predates the Somio investigation by weeks. But the routing record Kwan identified this morning changes his status from a peripheral figure in the original documentation to a primary actor. What does the routing record show? Varadarajan glanced at Kwan. He opened his laptop and turned it toward her. Signal traffic from the third day of Calderon Valley. There was a communication sent from a planning office to the 2 field-level individuals in the original AAR, approximately 4 hours before the decision to restrict documentation. The content is a directive, not a suggestion, a directive, specifying how the incident was to be characterized in the formal record. He paused. It was sent from Selwyn's office, under his authentication credentials. She looked at the screen. The document was partially redacted. She could see the structure, the header information, the authentication markers, the timestamp, but enough was visible to understand what Kwan was describing. Selwyn had not been peripheral. Selwyn had been the origin point. The 2 field-level individuals she'd known about had been executing an instruction, and the instruction had come from a level up. 14 months. She'd spent 14 months constructing a model of what had happened and who was responsible, and the model had been accurate as far as it went, and it had not gone far enough. She handed the laptop back. She looked at Varadarajan. "Where's Selwyn right now?" "Building C, Conference Room 3. The logistics session broke for lunch 20 minutes ago." "Does he know about the routing record?" "No, Kwan found it this morning. The review team was briefed an hour ago. The decision about next steps is Harwick's." She went into the office. Harwick was standing at his window when she came in, which was different from his seated posture of earlier. This was the posture of someone thinking on their feet, processing a rapid change. He turned when she entered. "You've been briefed," he said. "Enough to understand the shape of it." He moved to his desk but didn't sit. The routing record establishes Selwyn as the originating authority for the documentation restriction. That makes the original review scope significantly inadequate. We had 2 individuals under review. We should have had 3, and the most consequential one was a degree further up the chain than we understood. He looked at her directly. This changes what happened to you on record in a specific way. The voluntary separation was directed, not by you. He paused. The routing record includes a communication, a separate one, also from Selwyn's authentication, that was sent the week before your processing out date. It outlines a preferred outcome for your separation that matches what was documented. She heard this. She let it move through her without reacting to it in the way she could feel herself wanting to react. The sudden retroactive anger of understanding not just what had been done, but how deliberately it had been architected, how specifically she had been managed toward an outcome that served someone she'd barely known. She had been removed, not because of a breakdown in the aftermath of a difficult operation, not even because of the individuals she'd thought were responsible, because Brant Selwyn, from his planning office, had decided she was a variable that created inconvenience for a version of events he needed to maintain, and had done something about it. "What happens now?" she said. Her voice was flat. She was working to keep it flat. "Selwyn is going to be asked to remain on the installation pending a formal review notification. That process begins today." Harwick's voice carried the specific weight of institutional authority being deployed deliberately, without drama, which was in some ways more effective than any version of it that came with drama attached. He will not be told why until the notification is served. That's a legal requirement. How long does the process take? Weeks, possibly months, for the full adjudication. But the notification triggers immediate administrative actions, security access restrictions, command notification, the formal investigation opening. He paused. There will be nothing quiet about it. She nodded. She looked at the window, at the installation outside it, at the unremarkable tan building across the way that was currently hosting a logistics conference that one of its attendees was not going to finish. She thought about what she felt, and what she felt was complicated in a way she hadn't anticipated. She'd expected clarity, the clean resolution of a long-standing wrong, the satisfaction of a thing finally being named accurately, and some of that was present. But underneath it was something more ambiguous, the recognition that the correction of an injustice doesn't undo the time that passed under it, that the 14 months in Tucson existed regardless of what any record now said about them, that she had built something in those months, small and controlled but real, and the correction didn't make that disappear either. She had been wronged. The wronging was being addressed. Those 2 things were both true and neither canceled the other, and living honestly with both of them at once was harder than she'd thought it would be. "The service record correction," she said. "You said 3 weeks. Given the expanded scope of the review, some of the factual basis has strengthened. I think we can move faster." He looked at her. "A week, possibly less." She absorbed this. "And Selwyn will not be in a position to affect any current personnel decisions or program authorizations." He said it with certainty that she understood was a guarantee. She looked at him. "Then I'll be here in a week," she said. Fun. She didn't go to the conference building. She didn't look for Selwyn, didn't find a reason to walk past Building C on her way to the car. She'd thought about it for about 30 seconds and decided against it, because confrontation with someone in the process of being formally reviewed was not something that served her, and because what she wanted was not the conversation, it was the outcome. And the outcome was in motion without her needing to stand in front of the man who had engineered 14 months of her life and tell him that she knew. He would know. The notification would tell him. The process would tell him. The expanded record would tell him in precise, documented detail exactly what was now in official circulation and what it meant for every decision he'd made. That was enough. That was, if she was being accurate with herself, more than enough. She drove back to Tucson. She called Okafor from the road. "Harwick's moving on the notification today," she said. "I know. He called me an hour ago." A pause. "How are you?" It was a simple question and she didn't have a simple answer for it. "I'm figuring that out." That's honest. "I keep thinking I should feel something cleaner than I do." "Clean is for people who weren't actually in it," Okafor said. "You were in it. It's going to be messy for a while. That's not a failure of resilience, it's just accurate." Lena drove in silence for a moment. The desert was doing the thing it did in the late afternoon, going from white to gold, the mountains ahead of her catching the changing light. 14 pages, she said, and a half. Why didn't you tell me you submitted it? Okafor was quiet for a moment. Because you would have told me not to. True. She couldn't argue with it. Thank you, she said. Don't make it a big thing. It was a big thing. Then don't make it a bigger thing than it already is. A pause, and she could hear Okafor's voice soften by a fraction, which for Okafor was equivalent to someone else's considerable emotional display. You're going to be all right, Lena. You were always going to be all right. I just wanted the record to say it correctly. The week passed differently than any week in the previous 14 months, which had been weeks defined largely by what they didn't contain. This one had weight to it, specific, forward-leaning weight, the quality of time that is moving towards something rather than away from something else. On Wednesday, Quan sent her the expanded documentation package for her review, the full routing record, the secondary communications, the formal review notification that had been served to Selwyn on Tuesday afternoon. She read it carefully, all of it, including the parts that were difficult to read, and she let herself sit with the difficulty rather than moving past it. She owed herself that. Selwyn had been notified at 14:30 Tuesday. His security access had been suspended at the same moment. The logistics conference had been disrupted in the specific way that institutional processes disrupt things. Not dramatically, not with visible confrontation, but with the quiet withdrawal of authorization that changes everything a person can do, and access from one minute to the next. He'd been escorted to a waiting area. His command had been notified. The investigation was formally open. She hadn't been there. She'd read about it in the documentation. She thought that was probably the right way to have received that information, at a distance, in text, where she could read it without her face in the room and without having to manage her reaction in front of anyone. On Thursday, Harwick's office called to tell her that the service record correction was being processed and would be complete by Friday afternoon. She was in the parking lot of a grocery store in Tucson when the call came. She sat in her truck after she hung up and looked at the steering wheel for a while. The correction. The formal amendment that would say, in official language, what had actually happened. Not the managed version, not the version that had served Selwyn's interest in a clean narrative, but the accurate version, the one that Okafor had preserved and Quan had reconstructed and Harwick had authorized. She thought about the woman who had signed the separation papers 14 months ago. She'd been exhausted. She'd been operating on the residue of an operation that had gone badly in specific ways, on the specific grief of having tried to prevent certain outcomes and failed to prevent them, and on the added weight of a process that had been managed against her while she was too depleted to fight it effectively. She had signed the papers because fighting had felt like it required more than she had, and because she'd made the calculation that she could build something from what remained. She had built something. The rented house and the contractor badge and the 47-minute drive, and the canvas chair and the mountain views and the granola bars, and the portal reports marked urgent that nobody read. She'd built a life that was smaller than she was, and she'd called it choice, and Okafor had looked at it from the outside and called it by its accurate name. She drove home. She made dinner, she slept, and this time it was easier. Friday afternoon, she drove to Fort Aldrin for the third time in a week. The service record correction was waiting in Harwick's office in the form of a document that was less dramatic than she'd imagined it would be. Several pages of formal amendment language, the kind of bureaucratic precision that translated enormous personal significance into measured official prose. It said what had happened. It said what the accurate characterization of her separation was. It said that the previous characterization had been made under directed circumstances that had since been identified and were subject to formal review. It did not say she'd been wronged in the language she would have used if she'd been writing it. Government documents didn't work that way, and she'd known they wouldn't, and she'd decided before she came in that she wasn't going to need them to. What mattered was the content, not the register. She signed the acknowledgement form. Harwick signed the authorization. Varadarajan witnessed. "There's one more thing," Harwick said, after the paperwork. He handed her a second document. This one was less bureaucratic, a formal letter of recognition from SOCOM Southwest, citing her service record, citing the Hargrove incident specifically, citing the 14 months of contractor work and the observation capacity she'd brought to it. It was the kind of document that got included in personnel files and referenced in professional evaluations and served, in the quiet institutional language of the military, as a form of public acknowledgement that required no announcement to carry weight. She read it. She set it down on the desk. "Thank you," she said. The words felt inadequate for what she meant, but sometimes the inadequate words were the ones that were true. "Monday," Harwick said. "The pilot program begins its formal planning phase. I'd like you in the room." "I'll be there." She drove back to Tucson for what she knew, as she was driving it, was the last time she'd make that drive as the person who'd been making it for 3 weeks. The truck, the cracked road, the desert going amber in the late afternoon, the mountains receiving the light and giving it back changed. She drove it completely, let it be what it was, didn't rush toward what was next. She called Rourke that evening. She hadn't planned to. She'd been standing in the kitchen of the rented house eating crackers and cheese because she hadn't gotten to the grocery store since Wednesday, and she'd thought about the range and about Rourke standing at the edge of it with his rifle and his complicated expression, and she'd made the call before she'd fully decided to. He picked up on the second ring. "Vasquez." "The service record was corrected today," she said. "I'm starting the program Monday." A pause. Not an awkward one. Rourke was not a man who produced awkward silences. He produced thinking silences, which were different. "I heard some of what happened," he said. "Not all of it." "You don't need all of it." "No." Another pause. "Are you good?" It was the same question Okafor had asked, and she gave him the more direct version of the answer, because she thought he could use directness. "Getting there." "That's honest," he said, which was what Okafor had said, and she thought that said something about both of them. "I wanted you to know," she said, "that the program, the integration role, it exists partly because of what happened at Hargrove. The equipment failures, the documentation that went unread." She paused. "That situation was the case study. It was what Harwick used to get the authorization." He was quiet for a moment. She could imagine him processing this, the particular discomfort of understanding that his behavior had been part of the mechanism that created a corrective. "I'll take that," he said. "Not easily, but honestly." "The apology you gave me on Thursday," she said. "Yes. I accepted it. But I want to be clear about that. I'm not carrying it." Another silence, this one with a different quality, something releasing in it. "Thank you," he said. "Don't make it a big thing." She heard him, very quietly, make a sound that might have been a short laugh. She hadn't heard him laugh before. It suited him better than she'd expected. "What?" 3 weeks later, the Somio pilot program held its first formal session at Fort Aldrin. 12 personnel were in the room, senior medical specialists, all with special operations backgrounds, all in roles that had previously carried advisory status. Lena was at the front of the room, not because she'd sought the position, but because the position existed and she was the person who'd agreed to lead it. And so she was there, with a briefing outline and a cup of coffee that was better than anything she'd had at Hargrove. She looked at the room before she started. 12 people who had spent various portions of their careers doing what she'd been doing for 14 months, bringing expertise to environments that didn't fully account for it, flagging things through channels that moved slowly or not at all, making themselves useful within the perimeter of what they'd been told they were allowed to be. She thought about what to say to them, and she decided against saying any of the things she'd outlined in the briefing document, which were accurate but not what the moment actually required. "The problem we're here to fix," she said, "is not that the military undervalues medical personnel. It's that it has a consistent institutional habit of sorting people into categories, and then treating the categories as more real than the people." She paused. "Some of you have been sorted into a category that made you less than what you actually are. That's what the program is designed to address. Not symbolically, operationally, with authority, with documentation chains that work, with a formal structure that makes your observations count before something breaks rather than after." She looked at the room. "That's the job. Let's talk about how we do it." What? The adjudication process for Selwyn ran for 4 months, which was faster than these things typically moved, and which, Varadarajan told her in a brief call, was partly a function of the routing record being unusually clean evidence, and partly a function of the 2 individuals from the original AAR, who, once confronted with the expanded documentation, made the calculation that cooperation was more useful to them than continued silence. She was not in the room for any of it. She received updates through Okafor and through Veratarajan's periodic briefings, and she read the formal notifications when they arrived, and she processed each one with the specific quality of attention she'd learned to bring to things that mattered, fully, without looking away, but also without letting them become the only thing she was carrying. Selwyn was formally separated from service 5 months after the routing record was identified. The separation was not voluntary. The documentation that accompanied it said clearly what he had done and what the consequences were, and that documentation was part of the permanent record, which meant it would say what it said as long as records existed. The 2 field-level individuals received administrative actions proportionate to their roles. They had been following direction, but they had also made decisions, and both things were true, and both were accounted for. She read the final adjudication notification on a Thursday morning in her office at Fort Aldrin, which was not the same office she'd had before Calderon Valley, that had been at a different installation, but was an office she had now, with a desk and a window and a coffee maker that she'd bought herself because the one in the break room produced something she couldn't endorse. She read the notification twice. Then she set it down and looked out the window at the installation, which was fully alive at this hour. People moving, vehicles running routes, the distant sound of something on a range, the continuous organized purpose of a place that had been doing its work every day regardless of what was happening in any individual's story. She thought about what the adjudication meant and what it didn't mean. It meant the record was accurate. It meant the people responsible were accountable in the formal sense, the sense that leaves a mark in systems and affects what happens next. It meant the machinery of institutional justice had done what it was supposed to do, slowly and imperfectly, and without the dramatic clarity of a single moment, but completely. It didn't mean the time was returned. It didn't mean Calderon Valley was undone, or the operation's worst day was made better, or the people who had been part of that day were any different. It didn't mean she was the same person she'd been before the separation, because she wasn't. The 14 months in Tucson had made her something, and some of that something was loss, and some of it was the specific capability that comes from learning to operate without the infrastructure you built your sense of purpose inside. Both things were true. She'd stopped needing them to resolve into a single thing. Okafor came to Fort Aldrin in the spring. She was transitioning between assignments and had a week of leave, and she drove down in a truck that was older than Lena's and in considerably better shape, which said something about the difference in how they'd spent the intervening years. They went to dinner at a place outside the installation that Lena had found in her first month at Fort Aldrin. A small restaurant, not impressive from the outside, with a menu that didn't have many items but executed the items it had with the focused competence of a kitchen that knew exactly what it was doing. She'd always liked competence more than ambition. Okafor looked at the menu for about 15 seconds and set it down. "You look better," she said. "Better than what?" "Than the last time I saw you, which was 17 months ago, and you were processing out." She paused. "You looked like someone who had decided to be smaller." "I was." "And now?" Lena thought about it. The office at Fort Aldrin, the 12 people in the pilot program's first session, the documentation chains that actually worked now, the updated version of herself that existed in official records and matched the one walking around in the world. "Now I'm the right size," she said. Okafor made a small sound that was not quite a laugh but contained one. "That's the most you thing you've ever said." They ordered. The food was good, which was what she'd expected. They talked for 3 hours, which was longer than she'd expected, ranging across the kinds of topics that two people cover when they've been carrying a shared history in separate locations for a significant period of time, the adjudication and the program, and the people they'd worked with, and the places the work had taken them, and the things those places had cost. At some point, the conversation landed on Rourke. "He's at Pendleton now," Okafor said. "I heard he requested assignment to a training integration working group, the kind that reviews how personnel with combined backgrounds are utilized." Lena absorbed this. "You're sure?" "I looked it up," Okafor said, without a trace of apology. "He requested it after Hargrove, after the Somio visit." She paused. "I thought you should know." She thought about Rourke, not with anger, which had never quite been the right word for what she'd felt about him, with the more complicated emotion of someone who had been genuinely wronged by a genuinely capable person. the specific difficulty of holding both of those true at once without letting either absorb the other. He had been wrong about her. He had been arrogant and institutional, and he had put a category over a person and operated from the category. He had also, when the category was dismantled, found a way to stand in the wreckage of his assumption and not look away from what it revealed. And then he had, quietly, done something about it. That wasn't nothing. It wasn't everything. It was what it was. Good, she said. Okafor looked at her over her glass. That's generous. It's accurate, Lena said. Different thing. Bokemt. She thought, in the months that followed, about what she had learned, not in the abstract, motivational way that people talk about lessons, but in the specific operational way she thought about most things. The actual sequence of events and what they produced in terms of understanding. She'd learned that invisibility was a strategy, not a permanent state, and that she'd been confusing the two. She'd made herself invisible as a form of protection and called it preference, and the distinction had mattered more than she'd admitted. She'd learned that institutional systems, for all their slowness and imperfection, did sometimes produce accurate outcomes. Not always, not reliably, not without people willing to do what Okafor had done, and Kwan had done, and Harwick had finally done, take the accurate record and refuse to let it stay buried. The system alone hadn't corrected anything. The system had been the mechanism. The people had been the force. She'd learned something harder, something that took longer to name. That being underestimated is not something you can fully prevent or fully ignore. You can respond to it. You can refuse to shrink inside it. You can continue doing the work with the same precision regardless of whether the precision is being seen. And you can trust, not naively, not without evidence, but on the basis of the way things actually work over time, that the precision accumulates, that the work says what it says eventually, that the gap between who you are and what a category has decided you are will eventually become visible to someone with the authority and the will to close it. Not always. Not for everyone. She knew that. She was not unaware of the people who had done exactly what she'd done and had not been in the right place at the right moment for the right combination of Okafor and Kwan and Harwick, and a routing record sitting in a 14-month-old signal archive waiting to be found. She'd been lucky. She'd also been exactly who she was, and those two things weren't in contradiction. Well, in the fall of that year, the Somyo integration program completed its pilot phase and was formally adopted as a standing structure within Special Operations Training Command. 12 pilot positions became 40. The documentation chain that Lena had specified as a condition of her agreement, the one that routed observations above the installation level without requiring installation command approval, became standard across all training environments under the program's scope. The announcement was internal. There was no ceremony, no public acknowledgement in the way civilian institutions sometimes mark significant changes. There was a memo and a program authorization document and a meeting in Harwick's office that included Lena and Varadarajan and 3 other senior figures who had been part of the evaluation. Harwick thanked her briefly and specifically, in the way he did most things, without excess, without performing the gratitude, just saying it and meaning it, and trusting that she'd understand the weight of it without elaboration. She understood. She drove home from Fort Aldrin that evening on a different road than the one she'd used to drive to and from Hargrove. A better road, a shorter one that didn't have the quality of going between 2 separate lives, but simply of going home. The desert was doing its evening thing, the amber going to copper, going to the deep flat blue that preceded dark, the mountains receiving the last of the light and releasing it slowly. She thought about the canvas chair outside the medical tent, the granola bars, the portal reports marked urgent, the 47-minute drive that had felt like commuting between the person she was and the person she'd been allowed to be. She thought about Rourke saying you're a nurse with the certainty of someone who had confused a title for a ceiling, and about the expression on his face when Varadarajan said the title she'd carried before the managed separation. She thought about what it cost to be the person in the room who knows what they know and is not yet in the position where what they know is being received. The specific grinding patience of it, the choice, and it is a choice every single day, to continue doing the work with full precision regardless of whether the precision is being acknowledged. To not let the diminishment of others become the diminishment of yourself. Not because it's easy. It isn't. Not because it always resolves the way it should. It doesn't, not for everyone, and she was honest enough with herself to hold that without looking away. But because what you know is what you know. Because the work you do is the work you do. Because who you are does not require the permission of a category to be real. And because the most durable form of strength she had ever encountered, in combat, in hospitals, in training ranges and government offices, and the hard middle spaces of her own life, was not the kind that announced itself. It was the kind that showed up, that filed the reports, that noticed the hairline fracture in the housing before anything broke, that sat in the canvas chair and did the job completely and trusted, without certainty but with conviction, that the gap between what was and what should be would eventually close. She pulled into her driveway. The house was lit from inside. She'd left the kitchen light on, which she'd started doing because she'd learned, in those 14 months, the specific loneliness of arriving somewhere dark. A small thing, all a true one. She sat in the truck for a moment after the engine died, in the quiet of the end of a day that had been a long time in arriving, and she thought about all of it, the whole shape of it, the cost and the correction, and the 14 months and the routing record in the office at Fort Aldrin and the 40 positions that had been 12, and what all of it meant. What it meant was this: the work done in silence is not wasted. The precision brought to things nobody is watching still shapes what happens. And the woman sitting quietly in the corner, doing her job completely, seeing what others decide isn't worth seeing, she is not waiting to become significant. She already is.